He set his fork down when I said it. Not the way someone does when they're thinking carefully. The way someone does when they've just realized the person across the table is no longer the version they needed her to be. My name is Sarah. I'm 31 years old. I've been married for 4 years, and for 3 of those 4 years, I have been the only person in this household who treated our finances like they were real. I'm a senior financial analyst. I track numbers for a living. I find the discrepancies that companies try to bury. I do it every single day, and somehow, I let the same thing happen in my own home, quietly, incrementally, until the total became a number that made my hands go cold when I finally added it up. My husband's younger brother had been out of steady work since before we got married. My husband always described it as a rough patch. 2 years into our marriage, it was still a rough patch. My mother-in-law called it a sensitive situation. My father-in-law didn't call it anything because he'd learned, like everyone else in that family, that the easiest way to exist was to not name things out loud. The first time my brother-in-law asked for money, it came through my husband. $300. Car registration. He'd pay it back end of the month. I said fine. I transferred it from my personal account because our joint account was still new, and I didn't want to make it complicated. End of the month came and went. My husband mentioned it once, casually over dinner. His brother said he was short. Next month, he said. I nodded. I put it somewhere in the back of my mind where I stored things I decided weren't worth the argument. That was my first mistake. Not the money, the filing. The requests came with rhythm after that. Never large enough to feel urgent. 400 here, 250 there. Always filtered through my husband, always with a reason that sounded temporary. A medical thing, a deposit that fell through, a paycheck that was late. My husband relayed them the way you'd relay weather updates. Neutral, informational, like there was no question I would help, which meant there was also no actual asking. I want to be honest about something. I didn't say no because I was afraid of what it meant if I did. Not afraid of my brother-in-law. Afraid of being the wife who made things hard. Afraid of confirming something my mother-in-law had implied once, only once, at a Sunday dinner in the first year of our marriage, when she said with her warmest smile that she hoped I wasn't one of those women who kept separate buckets. She'd laughed right after, touched my hand, said she was only teasing. I smiled and agreed, and spent the next 3 years proving I wasn't one of those women. The Sunday dinners were a fixture. Every few weeks, same house, same overlit dining room. Same dynamic where I arrived, having contributed something, a dish, a bottle of wine, occasionally a check to cover a bill my mother-in-law mentioned in passing, and left feeling vaguely like I'd passed a test I hadn't studied for. My brother-in-law was always there, charming in the way that people who've never been held accountable tend to be charming. Self-deprecating about his situation in a way that made it seem like he found it funny, which made it seem like you should find it manageable. He had a talent for making his problems feel light, even as they accumulated weight in my bank account. The dinner where things shifted was in October. My brother-in-law had just gotten what everyone was calling a big opportunity. A logistics company, a regional coordinator role, good pay. My mother-in-law had made his favorite meal. There were congratulations and toasts, and my father-in-law clapped him on the shoulder. My husband looked genuinely relieved, the way someone looks when a years-long tension finally releases. I was happy for him. I want to be clear about that. I was. Then my mother-in-law reached across the table and patted my hand and said, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, that none of this would have been possible without family support. She looked at my husband when she said it. She looked at me. She said some people give more than they'll ever ask for, and that's what makes a family hold together. She said it like a toast, like a tribute. Everyone smiled. My husband looked at me and smiled. I smiled back. I excused myself to use the restroom and stood over the sink for a full minute with the water running, looking at my own face, and thought, she just thanked me publicly for money I was never formally asked to give, for a result I was never included in, at a table where no one knows exactly how much I actually put in. I drove home with my husband and he was in a good mood for the first time in months. He talked about his brother's potential, about how the pressure had finally lifted, about how maybe things would normalize now. I listened. I said the right things. I was quiet in the way that sounds like contentment and isn't. That night, I opened my laptop. I want to explain what I do professionally because it matters here. I build models. I trace flows. I look at where money enters a system and where it leaves, and I identify every point where something doesn't reconcile. I've been doing it for 9 years. I do it so automatically that I sometimes catch errors in restaurant receipts without meaning to. I had never done it for my own life. I pulled every account. Personal. Joint. The credit card I'd added my husband to 2 years ago as an authorized user. I exported 3 years of transactions and I sorted them by recipient, and I let the numbers talk. The total in direct transfers to my brother-in-law, through my husband or directly from my accounts when my husband asked me to handle it, was $11,400. I sat there for a long time. Not because the number destroyed me. Because I recognized it. It was a number I would have flagged immediately in any professional context. It was exactly the kind of slow accumulation I trained clients to notice. Frequent small transactions. Consistent recipient. No formal documentation. No repayment history. I would have written a memo about it. I would have escalated. I had watched it happen in my own home and filed it under trust. I kept going. The credit card showed something I hadn't expected. 4 charges over 14 months that I didn't recognize. 3 of them were service subscriptions. One was a partial payment on a security deposit, $1,500, to a property management company in my husband's brother's city. The billing name on the card was mine. My husband was the authorized user. He was the only other person with access. I pulled up the property records. My brother-in-law had moved into a new apartment 18 months ago, the same month as that deposit charge. I closed the laptop. I did not confront my husband that night. I'm not built for confrontation in the dark, when emotions are high and facts are still assembling. I've seen what that produces. I went to bed, and I lay there, and I thought about the dinner, and my mother-in-law's hand on mine, and the way my husband smiled at me across the table like everything was fine, and I understood, clearly, that he thought it was fine. That was the part that landed hardest. Not that he'd done it. That he thought it was fine. The next 3 days, I moved carefully. I didn't change anything yet. I gathered documentation the way I'd gather it at work. I screenshotted. I downloaded. I organized everything into a folder on my personal drive with a name that would mean nothing to anyone else. I called my bank and asked about the authorization trail on that credit card charge. I called the property management company under the pretense of a reference check and confirmed the deposit date and the name on the account used to fund it. Then I made an appointment with a financial attorney. Not because I had decided anything, because I wanted to know what my options were before I made any decisions, and because I had learned, slowly and at some cost, that information is the only thing that actually protects you. My husband noticed something was different before I said anything. He asked twice if I was okay. I said I was tired. He accepted that because it was easier. I watched him accept it, and I felt something I can only describe as a long, quiet grief, not for what had happened, but for the version of this marriage I had believed in that apparently only one of us had been maintaining. I told him on a Thursday evening. I didn't frame it as an accusation. I sat across from him at the kitchen table with the folder open, and I walked him through it the way I'd walk a client through an audit. Here is the transaction. Here is the date. Here is the recipient. Here is the amount. Here is the cumulative total. Here is the charge I did not authorize on an account in my name. He went pale somewhere around the 3rd page. He said he didn't think of it as her money specifically. He said they were married, so it was both of theirs. He said his brother was struggling, and it wasn't a big deal. He said he was going to pay it back once his brother was stable. He said a lot of things, and none of them were, "I'm sorry." I asked him directly about the credit card charge. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd needed to help with the deposit, and there wasn't cash available, and he thought I wouldn't notice. Not that he'd planned to tell me later. That he thought I wouldn't notice. There it was. I closed the folder. I told him I needed a few days to think, and I meant it. I wasn't performing distance. I genuinely needed to think, because the question I was sitting with wasn't about my brother-in-law, and it wasn't about the money. It was about what it meant that my husband looked at my account and saw a resource he could access without asking. What it meant that he had watched me fund his family for 3 years and never once thought to make it formal or discuss it or check whether I was okay with the shape of it. What it meant that the word he used when he thought about the money we'd spent was both of ours, but the word he'd used when deciding where it went was his. The financial attorney was thorough. She went through the documentation with the same kind of attention I'd used to compile it. She used the word misappropriation once, without drama, as a category. She explained what could be pursued and what would be difficult to prove, and what the practical costs were of each option. She asked me what outcome I was looking for. I told her I wanted accountability, not destruction. She said she understood the distinction. She also told me that because the credit card charge had been made without my consent on an account in my name, I had specific options that were different from the general financial dispute. I left her office and called my brother-in-law directly. I had never done that before. Not about money, not about anything significant. Our relationship had always been mediated through my husband, which I now understood was part of the structure. I told him I had done a review of our finances, and I had documentation going back 3 years, and I needed to discuss repayment. My voice was level. I told him I had also identified a credit card charge made without my authorization, and that I was consulting with an attorney about how to address it. He was quiet in a different way than my husband had been quiet. There was no deflection in it. He said his brother hadn't told him I would find out. I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment. I said I needed a written acknowledgement of the outstanding total and a proposed repayment timeline by the end of the week. I said if I didn't receive it, I would proceed with the legal avenue for the unauthorized charge, and that the documentation I had would be part of that process. I said I preferred to resolve this privately, but that preference had a deadline. He said he would call me back. My husband called me first. He'd already talked to his brother. His voice was tight in a way I recognized, the voice he used when he was managing himself because he didn't want to say what he was actually thinking. He said I didn't need to bring attorneys into it. He said his brother was scared. He said this was a family matter. I told him it had always been a family matter, and that was exactly the problem. Because in this family I had consistently been treated as a resource rather than a member, and I was no longer willing to operate on those terms. He said I was being cold. I said I was being precise. My mother-in-law called 2 hours later. I let it go to voicemail. She left a long message that started warmly and tightened as it went, moving through concern and into something more like pressure. She said she had raised her sons to take care of the people they loved. She said I was threatening the stability of the whole family. She said she hoped I would think about what was really important here. I listened to the message twice. Then I forwarded it to my attorney, along with a note about the timeline. The written acknowledgement came 4 days later, not from my brother-in-law directly, but through a text from my husband, who had clearly drafted it or helped draft it, acknowledging the total amount and proposing a repayment plan over 18 months. I read it. I sent back a revised version through my attorney that included the credit card charge as a separate line item, added a clause about a default penalty, and changed the timeline to 12 months with a lump sum option. My mother-in-law stopped calling after that. My husband said she was devastated. I told him I was sorry she was upset and that the terms of the repayment were non-negotiable. He looked at me for a long moment like he was waiting for me to soften. I didn't. What happened next is the part that I think about most when I think about how systems protect themselves. My brother-in-law agreed to the revised terms within 48 hours. Not after argument or negotiation. Just agreed. My attorney said this sometimes happened when people understood the alternative clearly. I understood it differently. I understood it as confirmation that the situation had always been solvable and had continued as long as it did because no one had ever treated it as something that required solving. My husband and I had a long conversation the night the agreement was signed. Not a fight. He was past fighting by then. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands around a mug of coffee that went cold, and he talked for a long time about how he'd been trying to manage everyone. How he'd felt caught between his family and me. How he'd thought I was strong enough to absorb it. That last part landed differently than I think he intended it to. I told him that strong enough to absorb it was not the same as willing to absorb it, and that he had made a significant assumption in confusing the two. I told him that managing everyone was not a strategy. It was a way of avoiding choices, and that the choices he'd avoided had been made by default at my expense. I told him I didn't think he was a bad person. I thought he had never examined the shape of what we had, and now that he was looking at it, he was seeing something that was very hard to sit with. He asked me if we were okay. I didn't answer that night. I told him I needed to think about what okay meant now, because the version of okay I'd been operating inside of for 3 years had not actually been okay. I want to be honest about this part too. I did not want to leave. I want to be clear that ending a marriage is not a victory. I'm not telling this story because I left and everything was fine. I'm telling it because I stayed quiet for 3 years inside a structure that depended on my silence, and the day I stopped being quiet, the structure revealed exactly what it was. We went to couples counseling for 2 months. I went every session. My husband went most of them. The counselor was good. She was specific in the way good therapists are. She didn't let things stay vague. She named patterns and asked questions that made both of us uncomfortable, which meant she was doing her job. What came out of it, slowly, was something I hadn't fully articulated to myself before. The money was not the center of the problem. The money was the evidence. The center of the problem was that my husband had married me with a complete picture of who I was, what I earned, what I was capable of, and had quietly organized his understanding of our marriage around that picture in a way that was entirely convenient for him and that he had never once discussed with me. He hadn't done it maliciously. I believe that. He had done it the way people absorb the shape of a thing that benefits them, without asking whether the shape is fair. And I had let him. For 3 years I had performed reasonableness and flexibility, and I've got it and it's fine. And I had mistaken that performance for a healthy dynamic because no one was yelling and the bills were paid, and I had convinced myself that quiet meant stable. Quiet doesn't mean stable. Sometimes it just means one person has decided the cost of speaking is higher than the cost of staying silent. I had run that calculation wrong for a long time. My brother-in-law made his first 2 repayment installments on schedule. I don't think he and I will ever have a real relationship. I don't think that's a loss I need to grieve. The money was never the point for him either. The point was that I had been there and available, and no one had told him he needed to think too hard about what that meant, and when someone finally did, he adjusted. I separated from my husband 6 months after that October dinner. Not dramatically, not with a blow-up or a final moment of revelation. With the quiet and specific certainty of someone who has done the math. I found an apartment. I transferred what was mine back to accounts that were solely mine. I was generous where generosity was genuinely warranted, and I was exact where exactness was necessary. My attorney said I was one of the most organized clients she'd worked with. I took that as a compliment. My mother-in-law did not call me to wish me well. My father-in-law sent a text that said he was sorry things hadn't worked out, which I thought was honest enough. My husband, to his credit, did not try to make me the villain of this story, at least not to my face. I think he understood, by the end, that the story didn't really have a villain. It had a structure that had worked for everyone except me, and a woman who had finally stopped being willing to hold it up. Here is what I know now that I did not know in the early years of my marriage, or maybe that I knew and was too afraid to act on. Numbers are honest. Patterns don't lie. When the same category of problem keeps appearing in the same relationships with the same resolution, that is not a coincidence, and it is not a rough patch. It is a system. Systems don't change because you absorb them better. They change because someone makes it more costly to continue than to correct. I am not the woman who keeps separate buckets. I am the woman who knows exactly what is in every bucket, what was agreed to, and what the terms are. Those are different things. The first is about withholding. The second is about clarity. I spent 3 years trying to be the first so I wouldn't be seen as the second, and all it cost me was $11,000 and a marriage that had been quietly running on my labor without my full knowledge. I have a new apartment now. It is smaller than the house we shared, and it is entirely mine. The rent comes from one account. The contributions to that account come from one source. When I check the balance, the number is exactly what I expect it to be. That is not a small thing. I still think about the dinner, not with anger, mostly. I think about my mother-in-law's hand on mine and her warm voice thanking me for my generosity in front of people who had no idea what the word generosity was covering. I think about how pleased she looked, how certain, how completely she had categorized me. And I think about the version of me who sat at that table and smiled and said nothing and drove home and said nothing and lay in the dark and filed it away. She wasn't weak. She was patient in a situation that didn't deserve patience. She was reasonable inside a structure that had no interest in being reasonable back. And when she finally stopped, she did it without cruelty, without drama, without performing anything. She just opened the laptop. She just looked at the numbers. She just let what was true be true. What you're willing to accept teaches people what they can offer you. I learned that later than I should have, but I learned it completely. And the next person who sits across from me and mistakes my patience for permission will find that I have already done the audit, already drafted the letter, already scheduled the meeting. Not out of anger, out of the same calm precision I bring to every problem that was always solvable and only needed someone to decide it was worth solving. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I was never asking for that. I'm asking you to look at your own accounts. Not just the financial ones. The rest tends to follow.